Have you ever noticed that the story of Lot's daughters sleeping with their father in Genesis 19 seems to be told from a completely neutral perspective? Like seriously, there's not a single comment by the author in the entire story. And no reaction from God either. So does that mean they don't have a point of view on this? And that it's not really possible to know how what happens here should be evaluated? Hi, welcome to Masterpiece. My name is Chris, and I believe that the author actually does have a take on this and that he does communicate it to us. We just have to read the text attentively enough and pick up on the clues in the text which the author has left there through the way he tells the story. In fact, I believe there are at least 5 such clues in the text that show how the events in this story are to be evaluated, and here they are. Clue number 1. The unnecessary repetition of the words father and lie. Alright, so I've said this over and over again on this channel. If you want to understand biblical text better and know what the author is trying to say, you've got to pay attention to repetition. Especially if that repetition seems unnecessary or excessive in the sense that a word or phrase is repeated over and over again, even though the author could have used a synonym or a similar phrase. So if we apply that to this story, there are 2 words in particular that are repeated quite a lot. And that's the word father, which appears a total of 9 times, and the word lie, which is repeated 7 times. And in both cases, the author could have used other words. For example, instead of father, he could have said he or him. But he doesn't do that. He just keeps repeating the word father over and over again. And, did you notice, he always connects it with a possessive pronoun. It's always our father, my father, their father. Which means the repetition really emphasizes that it's not just anyone they are lying with. It's not even just any father. It's their father they are lying with. It's like the author is saying, these daughters, they actually slept with their own father and had children from him. It's kind of like in the story of Cain and Abel, where the author keeps repeating the word brother to emphasize how terrible Cain's crime was. Clue number 2, the connection to the previous story. So just like all other texts in the Bible, this story has been placed in a certain context, which means that when we as attentive readers see the combination of Lot plus daughters plus sex, this should ring a bell, because this exact combination also occurred just a few verses earlier. You remember, when Lot was still in Sodom, the men of the city came and wanted to sleep with Lot's visitors, but Lot instead offered them his 2 daughters who had not known any man, meaning they were virgins. Now the connection between these 2 scenes is interesting for at least 2 reasons. For one thing, it really highlights the ironic reversal where the daughters who were completely passive and used by their father for his purposes in the first scene now become very active, while Lot is completely passive and used by his daughters for their purposes. And where he, instead of the men of Sodom, actually becomes the one who causes them to lose their virginity. And second, the connection associates the deeds of Lot's daughters with the perverted sexuality of Sodom, which Lot calls evil and which exemplifies the wickedness of the people for which they are destroyed. In fact, it seems that one of the reasons why the author chose to include this final story about Lot and his daughters is in order to highlight the negative influence which Sodom had on Lot and his family. Clue number 3, the allusion to Genesis 9. Okay, so notice, in Genesis 19, we just had a divine judgment, and right afterwards, there's a father who drinks wine, and then he's lying somewhere, presumably at least partially naked, and 2 of his children interact with him, but he doesn't know what they are doing to him. Doesn't that remind us of something? Well, it should, because all of those elements already occurred in a previous story, and that story is, of course, the episode right after the divine judgment of the flood in Genesis 9, where Noah drinks wine and lies naked in his tent. His son Ham sees his nakedness and tells his 2 brothers, who then come and cover Noah up. And when he wakes up, it says that he knew what his younger son Ham had done to him. So very interesting parallels. But the question obviously is, why would the author want to allude to that previous story? Well, one of the reasons seems to be that he wants to connect the attitude of Lot's daughters with that of Ham, who looks at his father's nakedness and talks about it, and who is called the father of Canaan, just like the sons of the daughters are called the fathers of Moab and Ammon. So on the one hand, the author wants to connect the daughters of Lot with Ham, and on the other hand, he wants to contrast the attitude of the two daughters with the attitude of the two sons. Because while the daughters uncover their father's nakedness, the sons cover it. And when you look closely at that story in Genesis 9, you realize that it actually alludes to the story of the fall in Genesis 3, where God covers the nakedness of humans. So when the two sons of Noah cover his nakedness, they're actually acting like God. But Ham and the two daughters of Lot are not. Clue number 4, the connection to Genesis 24. So if you go to verse 31, you'll notice that the very first thing the firstborn says is that their father is old, and that there's no man that could sleep with them to produce offspring. Okay, so we've got an old father, but no men for the daughters. Now this is interesting because if you do a search on the word old, you discover that the next time this word occurs is in chapter 24, where it says in verse 1 that Abraham was old. Now think, what happens in chapter 24? Exactly, it's that story where Abraham sends his servants to find a wife for his son. So here we have an old father who is concerned about getting a wife for his son. And he's willing to go to great lengths to do that because he doesn't want his son to get married to a Canaanite woman. So he sends his servant all the way to the country where his relatives live so he can get a wife from there. So even though he's old, and it's not easy to find someone, he does everything he can to provide a wife for his son. Now compare that to Lot in Genesis 19. He's also old, but apparently he's been either unwilling or unable to provide husbands for his daughters. So instead of producing offspring in an honorable way, with a suitable member of the family provided by God, they produce offspring in a dishonorable way with an unsuitable family member whom they themselves chose. So the connection to chapter 24 really reflects negatively, not just on Lot, but also on his daughters. Clue number 5, the apparent impossibility to produce offspring. So obviously the daughters don't just sleep with their father for fun, but in order to have children, or as the firstborn says, to preserve seed or offspring. So really, this is a story about having descendants. And in particular, it's a story about having descendants when it seems impossible to do so in the normal way. Because the only reason they're sleeping with their father is that he's the only male person they seem to have access to. Okay, so having descendants when it seems impossible. Doesn't that sound familiar? Yeah, of course. That's basically the big issue in the surrounding narratives, where Abraham and Sarah are waiting to have a child, even though it seems impossible, because Sarah is barren and because they're both old. In fact, the only times the term old occurs prior to Genesis 19:31 is in Genesis 18:11-12 in connection with Abraham and Sarah. Now, once you see this connection to the Abram story, it's hard not to notice another parallel. Because in both cases, people actually find a solution so they can have offspring after all. Sarai has Abram sleep with her maid Hagar, and the daughters of Lot sleep with their father. Now notice the parallels. In both cases, there's a speech by a woman in which she tries to justify the following action, followed by a sexual act, followed by a pregnancy, and the birth of a child that will become the father of a nation. So in both cases, the human solution works. But does that mean it was the right thing to do? Well, if you've read the whole Abram story, you know that the answer is no. Because the human solution is always the one where people try to provide for themselves instead of trusting that God will provide for them, which is exactly the problem of Lot's daughters. They don't even seem to consider that God could help them. And it's quite telling that he doesn't appear once in the entire story. Now, once you realize all this, it's pretty obvious that the story is not told from a neutral perspective at all, but that the author is in a subtle yet clear way letting us know that what happened here was not good, and also what would have been the right thing to do in this situation. And as you may have noticed, one of the key ways the author does this is through allusions to other texts, which is actually a very common strategy in the Bible. And if you want to learn more about that, then go watch this video next. And if you want to know what else I discovered in Genesis 19, then check out this video right here. As always, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Ciao.